Take your truck to the next level with Rough Country's popular 3.5-inch lift kit for GM 1500s. Before you begin installation, review the included instructions and make sure you have all the required parts and hardware before proceeding. You'll also want to verify that you have all the proper tools before disassembling your vehicle. For more helpful tips to follow before you begin installation, visit roughcountry.com/beforeyoulift. To begin installation, jack up the vehicle and remove the tires and wheels. Remove the 6 bolts holding the factory skid plate using a 15mm socket. Retain the factory hardware and front skid plate for reuse. Unplug the connectors going to the electric power steering if equipped. Using a 21mm wrench, remove the tie rod end. Remove the sensor wire from the plastic clip. Remove the brake line bracket from the control arm using a 10mm wrench. Unplug and remove the ABS sensor wire from the frame. Remove the sway bar link with a 15mm socket and wrench. Remove the upper ball joint nut using an 18mm wrench. Strike the knuckle to dislodge the ball joint. Separate the upper control arm from the knuckle. Using an 18mm wrench, remove the upper strut nuts, being sure to retain factory hardware for reuse. Using a 15mm wrench, remove the 2 bolts securing the lower strut mount to the lower control arm and remove the strut from the vehicle. Remove and discard the factory lower retainer clips. Using a 21mm wrench and socket, remove the upper control arms from the vehicle. Retain the hardware. Using an 18mm socket and wrench, remove the 4 bolts holding the factory crossmember. Retain the factory hardware. Using a jack stand to support the front differential, remove the front driver and passenger bolts holding the diff mount to the frame with a 15mm and 18mm wrench. Lower the jack stand to allow enough room to slide the aluminum diff drop spacers into place. Using the supplied 7/16" by 4.5-inch bolts, washers, and nuts, tighten with a 16mm and 18mm socket and wrench. Repeat the process to install the spacers for the rear differential mounts as well. On the driver's side of the factory crossmember, measure from the end of the tube, making marks at 4.5 inches and 8 inches on the front side. Measure 1/4 inch for the bottom and 2 inches from the back side and mark. Using a die grinder, cut across the marks. Holding the freshly cut crossmember into place, check the clearance between the crossmember and front differential cooling fins, cutting or grinding the cooling fins down as needed to clear the crossmember. Insert factory hardware into the stock crossmember and tighten with an 18mm socket and wrench. Using factory hardware, install the new control arm in the factory mount, making sure the 1/4 inch stud for the mounting brake line bracket is toward the rear. Tighten using a 21mm wrench and socket. Install the supplied 10mm stud extensions into the new strut spacer using a 17mm socket to snug the stud into the spacer. Place the strut spacer on top of the stud and tighten using factory hardware and an 18mm wrench. Install the strut assembly in the factory mount with the supplied 10mm nuts, washers, and lock washers on the upper mount. Tighten using a 17mm wrench. Install the strut in the lower control arm. Reinstall the sway bar on the lower control arm using a 15mm wrench. Reinstall the knuckle to the upper control arm and tighten. Reinstall the tie rod end into the knuckle with factory hardware using a 21mm wrench. Install the brake line bracket on the control arm. Reconnect the ABS sensor wire. Locate and install the new lower skid plate below the differential in the factory location with the factory hardware using a 15mm wrench. Reconnect the electric power steering connectors if equipped. Remove the factory shock absorbers using a 21mm wrench and socket. Retain the factory hardware for reuse. Remove the factory U-bolts using a 21mm socket, then remove the factory blocks. Lower the axle to allow for the new 3-inch block to be installed. Install the block on the factory spring pad, with the flat part of the block on the spring and the thinner end towards the front. Raise the axle to meet the springs, making sure to align the center pin. Apply slight pressure to the rear axle to keep the pin aligned. Install the supplied U-bolts and tighten in a crossing pattern using a 7/8 inch socket. Install the new shock absorbers in the factory mounting locations using the factory hardware. Tighten using a 21mm wrench and socket. Reinstall the wheels and tires, lower the vehicle to the ground, and you're done. After installing any suspension component, it is advised that you have a qualified alignment center give your vehicle a proper alignment immediately. Have questions about your installation? We're always happy to help. Give us a call at 1-800-222-7023 or chat with us on the web at roughcountry.com.